Welcome to a story where the supernatural meets the inevitable. Get ready for the unexpected, where fear lurks in every shadow, and there's no way to escape. It was a summer afternoon, one of those that seemed to promise a bright future. The sky was cloudless, the sun illuminated every stretch of the road, and the gentle breeze passed through the open car window. Inside the vehicle, a couple exchanged smiles. She, with one hand on her rounded belly, felt the baby's movements, while he, the husband, kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting on a half-empty beer bottle. They were celebrating. The news of the baby's gender had filled their lives with a new joy, something they hadn't felt in a long time. The thought of a new life on the way was enough to make them forget, even for a moment, worries of daily life. And there, on that road, it seemed as if they were leaving behind their problems, fears, and even responsibilities. But not everything was as perfect as it seemed. In the driver's seat, the slight intoxication of the husband began to distort his perception. His laughter was a little louder, his reflexes a bit slower, and his eyes slightly blurred. She, immersed in thoughts about their child's future, didn't realize how dangerous the situation had become. Their world seemed protected by a bubble of happiness, but that bubble was about to burst. The road ahead, once so clear, started to blur for him. The signs, the curves, everything was there, but his alcohol-numbed mind could no longer process it with the same precision. He accelerated without thinking, without realizing, as if the heat of the moment was pushing him forward to a fate he could not avoid. And then, it happened. A small lapse in attention, a second of negligence, and the car swerved off course, heading straight for the path of another family coming in the opposite direction. It was an ordinary family, with smiles on their faces returning from a weekend getaway. At the moment of impact, all that happiness, light, and hope were consumed in a single instant of destruction. The sound of the collision was like thunder, tearing through the afternoon silence. Shattering glass, twisted metal, muffled screams from the impact. And when it all stopped, the scene was a chaos of bodies and wreckage. He was dead, without having felt the pain. She, miraculously unscathed, felt only the warmth of the sun, now mixed with the smell of gasoline and blood. But what she didn't know, as she looked at her husband's body and the destruction before her, was that that moment, that single second, would turn her life into a nightmare from which she would never awaken. The world around her seemed to stop. The deafening sound of the impact still echoed in her mind, but the reality before her was strangely silent. The car, which had been smoothly gliding down the road, was now immobilized amidst wreckage and twisted metal. The sun, which had once shone brightly, now seemed cruel as it illuminated the scene of horror. She blinked, trying to comprehend what had happened. Adrenaline coursed through her veins and her heart beat so fast it felt like it might escape her chest. She looked to the side and saw her husband, motionless, his head slumped over the steering wheel. Blood slowly trickled from a deep cut on his forehead, staining the steering wheel red. But he didn't move. Panic began to spread within her, but at the same time, a surreal feeling of denial took hold, as if it was all just a nightmare she would soon wake up from. Trembling fingers, she touched her belly, where her baby still moved, oblivious to the chaos of the outside world. A momentary relief washed over her as she realized that despite everything, the baby was fine. But that relief was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of fear and guilt. She wanted to get out of there, to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat, suffocated by terror. Then she heard it. Not a sound, but rather the absence of one. The silence around her was unsettling, heavy. She looked at the car ahead. The vehicle they had collided with was a scene she would never forget. The car was crushed, as if a giant hand had crumpled the metal with immense force. Inside, she could see the bodies. First, the father, his face turned to the side, eyes open, lifeless. Beside him, the mother, who seemed to have tried to protect their child until the last moment. And between them, in the back seat, the small body of a child, still clutching a toy in a little hand, would never move again. Her mind struggled to process the scene, find some meaning in the chaos. It was as if reality had fragmented, each piece cruelly exposed under the pitiless sun. But the only thing that made sense at that moment was the horror. The horror of knowing that those lives which just seconds before had been full of joy and future, were now lost forever. And she knew that her husband, now just a lifeless body, was responsible for this. But he could no longer answer for his actions. The responsibility now fell on her. The silence was broken by the distant sound of a siren. Help was on the way. For that family, there was nothing more to be done. And for her, the woman who still breathed, reality began to show itself as more terrifying than any nightmare she had ever had. She still didn't know, but the price of that fatal impact would haunt her far beyond that sunny afternoon. When the paramedics arrived, the scene was heartbreaking. As the bodies were removed with an almost solemn delicacy, she remained there, nearly motionless, holding her belly as if it were the only anchor keeping her grounded in reality. Questions came in a flood. What had happened? How had the accident occurred? But her voice seemed distant, as if she were speaking from within a dream. It was all so fast. I don't know, she murmured, avoiding the rescuer's eyes. But deep down she knew. She knew that her husband, with the scent of alcohol still fresh on his breath, was to blame for the disaster. But now he was dead, and the cold hands of fear began to grip her heart. What would happen to her and the baby? The shame, the scandal. What if people found out he had been drunk? She might be judged along with him, lose everything she had, including the child she carried. As these thoughts invaded her mind, she began to hear a voice in her head. Desperate and cruel voice that insisted on a way out, solution. And this voice suggested something terrible. To lie. To blame those who could no longer defend themselves. The family in the other car, the dead, don't speak. She knew she was entering dark territory. The fear of losing everything was overwhelming. When she was finally taken to give her statement, the words that came out of her mouth seemed to have a life of their own. The other car, they were speeding. They crossed the lane. I tried to swerve, but I couldn't. My husband tried. He was a good man. The lies coiled around her tongue like serpents. She continued, each word easier than the last. And in the end, she cried. Real tears that wavered between guilt and relief. The officer took notes, nodding, and when he finally closed his notebook, the sensation of having escaped began to spread through her body. But as she left the police station, a cold breeze, unusual for such a hot afternoon, enveloped her. And for a moment, brief moment, she felt as if someone was watching, as if invisible eyes were fixed on her, penetrating her lies and seeing the truth she was desperately trying to hide. She shook her head, dismissing the uncomfortable feeling, and returned to the car. But from that moment on, something began to change within her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the child's face in the back seat. Its eyes fixed, as if still alive, as if knowing exactly what she had done. Time passed, but the feeling of being watched never left her. At first, she tried to ignore it. She attributed the sleepless nights and recurring nightmares to the trauma of the accident, to the guilt that whispered in her ears as she struggled, in vain, to find peace. But there was something deeper, something darker, taking root in her mind. It was on a particularly silent night, just days after her husband had been buried, that things began to take a more concrete form. The house, once seemingly cozy, now seemed wrapped in an aura of tension. Every creak in the wood, every sigh of the wind made her startle. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the silence was almost unbearable. Then she heard it. At first, it was a soft sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the room she had begun to prepare for the baby. It was as if something was being dragged across the floor, a muffled sound that made her heart pound in her chest. She got up, hesitant, each step a burden, and walked to the room. The door was ajar, and for a moment, she had the sensation that something was moving inside. But when she pushed the door open, there was nothing. Nothing but the incomplete furniture and the walls painted a soft blue. She stepped inside, and suddenly the air around her seemed to compress, as if the temperature had dropped abruptly. A shiver ran down her spine, and her eyes fixed on the crib. There, in the dim light, she saw what appeared to be a shadow, small and indistinct, but it soon took form. It was a child, or at least something that resembled one. The figure stood there, next to the crib, its eyes fixed on her, eyes she instantly recognized. It was the boy from the car, the one she had seen dead, eyes open, in the back seat of the crushed vehicle. She was paralyzed, the blood in her veins frozen as the figure just stared at her, unmoving. There were no screams, no sudden movements, just a gaze that seemed to pierce her soul, silently judging her. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to drive that vision away, but her body didn't respond. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. She stumbled back, the terror still rooted in her mind. But the worst was yet to come. The apparitions didn't stop that night. They became more frequent, more intense, as if the spirit of that child was determined not to let her forget, not to let her live in peace. And each time it appeared, the guilt within her grew, turning her life into a waking nightmare. But the spirit wasn't satisfied with just tormenting her. It seemed to have a plan, a vengeance that was only beginning to unfold. And she, powerless before a force beyond comprehension, began to realize that the price of her lie would be paid with something far more precious than she could have ever imagined. As the days passed, the torment only intensified, and the woman, now alone, felt that the spirit of the child was determined to destroy her from the inside out. The baby, who should have been her source of joy, became a target of the malevolent presence inhabiting the house. Strange accidents began to happen around the baby, objects inexplicably falling near him, doors closing on their own, and shadows seeming to move in the corners of her vision. It was on a particularly dark night that the terror became unbearable. The woman awoke with a horrible premonition, a visceral certainty that something terrible was about to happen. She ran to the baby's room, only to find the crib empty. Desperation overtook her as she frantically searched the house, the baby's cries echoing from all directions, but with no clear source. Finally, in one of the darkest corners of the house, she found the baby, in the arms of the child's spirit, which was rocking him with an unsettling calm. The sight froze her with fear, her body incapable of reacting. The spirit looked at her with eyes filled with ancient hatred, deep resentment. She knew she was powerless before that entity, which had come to claim what it believed was its own. And that night, spirit took the baby for itself, leaving the woman on the brink of madness, unsure if it was real or if her mind had finally shattered under the weight of her guilt. But that night, she sat alone in the house, the sound of the wind outside seeming to whisper her name. She realized she was completely at the mercy of that vengeful entity. And that, no matter how hard she tried, there was no escaping the fate she had sealed with her lie. Following days became a blur of fear and paranoia. The woman, now a widow and mother, teetered on the edge of insanity. The child's spirit was no longer content with just appearing in her nightmares. It was everywhere, constant presence she felt in every corner of the house. Every time she looked at the baby, that primal fear consumed her. Fear that something terrible could happen at any moment. She began to hear whispers, voices that seemed to come from all directions, that always fell silent when she tried to locate. At night, the baby's cries echoed through the house, but when she went to the room, she found the little one sleeping peacefully. But she wasn't alone. She felt the spirit there, watching, waiting. The air around her always seemed colder, denser, as if something was draining the life out of the house. She avoided sleep at all costs to keep the nightmares at bay, but it was on one of those nights when the silence was as heavy as a tombstone that the spiral of madness began to unfold irreversibly. She fell asleep with a terrible sense that something was wrong. She began to dream that the room was dark, the moonlight barely illuminating the shadows, and the silence was disturbing. She looked at the crib and felt a chill when she realized the baby wasn't there. Desperation took hold of her as she ran through the house, calling for her child, but the only response was the echo of her own voice. Then, from downstairs, she heard the sound. A low, disturbing laugh. A laugh of a child who shouldn't be there. Her heart pounded uncontrollably as she descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last. At the bottom of the stairs, the scene that unfolded before her was terrifying. The child's spirit sat on the living room floor, holding the baby in its arms, gently rocking it as if it were its own. But what made her blood run cold was the expression on the entity's face. It wasn't that of a child. Something much older, much darker, an entity that carried deep hatred. She tried to move forward, to take the baby from its grasp, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed by terror as the spirit slowly lifted its head and fixed its dead eyes on her, eyes that seemed to pierce her soul. That gaze was a promise that the worst was yet to come. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, the spirit began to sing a lullaby, a distorted melody that echoed through the walls of the house. The sound seemed to fill the room, suffocating her. As the spirit rocked the baby with a perverse tenderness, its childish voice blending with the soft cries of the little one. That night didn't end. It was the beginning of a new phase of torment, where she no longer knew what was real and what was the product of her shattered mind. But one thing was certain. The child's spirit had claimed the baby as its own, and with each passing day, the woman felt she was losing the connection with her own child, while the malevolent presence grew stronger, more dominant. And she knew, deep in her soul, that more pain and suffering were on the way. Reality began to fragment, and time seemed to lose its meaning. The hours dragged on in a succession of terrifying moments as the child's spirit took control of the house, her life, and of the baby. She found herself trapped in an endless cycle of fear and guilt, with no one to turn to, isolated in her own home, which now seemed like a prison. She woke up in the middle of the night, the wind howling outside, terrified. She decided she couldn't live like this anymore. She needed to face it. She needed to save her child from the clutches of that malevolent entity. With trembling hands and her heart pounding frantically, she picked up the baby and decided to flee. To go anywhere, far from that cursed house, hoping that distance would free her from that unbearable presence. But as she tried to leave, something stopped her. Every time she tried to open the door, the lights flickered, and an invisible force seemed to pull her back. The spirit wasn't willing to let them go. In growing desperation, she began to pray, to murmur words of protection she remembered from her childhood, but it all seemed useless. The shadows around her seemed to close in as if the house were alive, keeping her trapped there. Then, suddenly, everything went quiet. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound, a void that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. She looked at the baby, who was surprisingly calm in her arms, and felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe somehow she had managed to break the spirit's influence. That hope was brutally shattered when she felt a cold touch on her shoulder. She turned slowly and saw the child's spirit, closer than it had ever been, its dead eyes fixed on her, overflowing with indescribable hatred. She tried to back away, but there was nowhere left to run. The spirit extended its hand and opened the door, letting her go. She started running to the car, not understanding why it would help her escape. Terror turned to pure panic as her vision darkened, and then, in that moment of absolute desperation, she got in the car and decided to flee as far as she could. But it wasn't the end. It was all part of a larger plan. On the road, the baby began to cry incessantly. For a moment, she turned to check on the baby, and next to the car seat was the vengeful spirit of the child. A moment of distraction caused her to lose control of the car and crash, not realizing where she was going. The accident occurred at the same spot as the previous one, and then, as the shadows closed in on her and the darkness took over, she heard the child's laughter, a sound that would echo in her mind until the end of her days. The spirit had won, and she, now unable to protect her child or herself, was consumed by the terror she had created. Darkness took over. The terror that had begun as an invisible presence now dominated everything around. She was unconscious for a few minutes, and when she awoke, she saw the terrible image of her child dead in the back seat of the car, with eyes open like the child's. What was once a family full of hope for the arrival of a new member had now turned into a nightmare, where reality and the supernatural intertwined in a perverse way. The child's spirit was no longer a distant figure in the shadows. It was everywhere, its presence permeating every corner, every breath. Then she felt the air grow heavier, as if the environment was closing in around her, and in the distance she began to hear the sounds of sirens approaching. Once again, she was on the same stretch of road involved in a terrible accident. This time alone, her child had been taken. She saw the child's spirit with a malicious, wicked smile, holding her baby in its arms. She tried to scream, to break free, but she was there, unable to move. In the blink of an eye, she saw the image of the child's parents with empty yet satisfied eyes. They had taken from her what was most precious. When the ambulance arrived and managed to get her out of the car, each step she took seemed more difficult, as if she were walking against an invisible current, with her heart pounding in her chest. After that day, she was diagnosed with what doctors called post-traumatic stress disorder and couldn't speak. She wandered aimlessly, without expressing any feelings, no pain or sign of response to the outside world. Her house was transformed. It was no longer the welcoming space she had lovingly prepared. The walls seemed to sweat. The ceiling was covered with dark stains that pulsed like veins. And in the center of the room where the crib should have been, there was something different. In place of the crib, there was a small coffin, a child's coffin. The silence that followed was terrifying. She had been completely consumed by terror, her child torn from her as part of a cruel and insane vengeance. And then everything went silent. The house, now empty and shrouded in shadows, returned to its former state, as if nothing had happened. But anyone passing by at night could swear they heard, in the distance, the cry of a baby and the laughter of a child, echoing through the walls of a place where time had stopped and terror had become eternal. The mother attempted suicide several times. She wanted to end her suffering, but it was as if everything around her conspired to keep her alive, consumed by her pain. She was admitted to a psychiatric hospital where she lived dark days for another 7 years until she died without any apparent cause. If you've made it this far, you know that fear is more than just a feeling. It's an experience that connects us to the unknown, the deepest and darkest parts of our imagination. If these stories awaken that unsettling curiosity in you, if the chill down your spine is something you seek, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel and join us in exploring the most terrifying mysteries, the most disturbing legends, and the tales that make the night seem endless. Here, fear is our companion, and every story is a new journey into the unknown. Come and be part of our community of terror lovers, and prepare to be haunted. Always.